Marleycombe, early June. The bunting fluttered lazily between the lime trees of Marleycombe Green, bright ribbons of red and white looping across the stalls. Children's laughter mingled with the steady hum of conversation, the faint bark of a dog tied to a post, and the dignified murmur of the vicar's wife, reminding everyone that the scone competition entries were to be placed just so on the judging table. It was the sort of afternoon that made the English countryside seem utterly content with itself, sunshine, gossip, and jam. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the shade of a parasol near the lemonade stall, a delicate china cup resting on the saucer in her lap. Her eyes, mild and unassuming behind wire-rimmed spectacles, drifted from face to face with what appeared to be absent-minded interest. In truth, she was studying everyone. There was Mrs. Elspeth Rowan, bustling about in a cloud of starch and indignation, insisting that her lemon scones were homemade, though Miss Marple strongly suspected the village bakery had lent an unseen hand. Then there was Major Hargreaves, the retired military man whose loud voice carried across the lawn like a foghorn, boasting, as usual, of his days in Ceylon, and, of course, young Mr. Peter Linton, the new schoolmaster, smiling far too warmly at Mrs. Rowan's niece, Miss Clara Brown. It was not the smile of an instructor. It was the smile of a man whose heart, or perhaps his sense of caution, had wandered off for the day. "Such a lovely occasion," murmured Mrs. Weatherby, settling beside Miss Marple, with a sigh that hinted she had already heard 3 scandals before luncheon. "Though between ourselves, my dear, I never quite trust lemon scones. There's something rather deceitful about them. You think you know what you're getting, and then, oh, a bitter surprise," Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, indeed, people and scones are sometimes not quite as sweet as they appear." The judging began at 3 o'clock sharp. Mrs. Rowan's lemon scones were arranged in a perfect circle, upon a lace doily, glistening faintly with sugar. The vicar, his wife, and Colonel Pembroke took turns tasting each entry with grave ceremony, as if the peace of England depended upon their verdict. It was only when the Colonel reached for the final plate that anyone noticed something amiss. He broke the scone in half, frowned slightly, and then, almost daintily, took a bite. For a moment nothing happened. Then his face drained of colour. "My word," he gasped. That's peculiar." He staggered backward, knocking over the teapot, and collapsed against the table with a dull thud that sent cups and plates crashing to the grass. A shriek pierced the summer air. The music faltered. Children stopped mid-laugh. Miss Marple was already on her feet. The Colonel lay motionless, his complexion grey and waxen. Mrs. Weatherby was flapping her handkerchief uselessly, and someone shouted for the doctor. The vicar bent down to feel for a pulse, his hands trembling. Within minutes Dr. Graham arrived from the next stall, where he had been judging marmalade. He knelt, examined the Colonel briefly, and looked up with a face that told everyone what they already feared. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "the Colonel is gone." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Rowan's voice rose above the others, thin, hysterical, and indignant. "But he ate my scone. He took mine." That single declaration seemed to hang in the air, a small sentence that changed the weather of the entire fete. Later, when the police arrived from Upper Marleycombe, the bunting still fluttered in the breeze, but the laughter was gone. Villagers huddled in uneasy clusters, whispering about poison and murder. Sergeant Webb, a capable but unimaginative man, quickly took charge. He ordered the plate of scones to be removed for examination. made notes in a rather self-important notebook, and assured everyone that these things happen. But we'll get to the bottom of it. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the lemonade table, observed all this without a word. Her sharp eyes, however, noticed something curious. Mrs. Rowan, despite her protestations of innocence, kept glancing toward the empty chair where her niece had been sitting earlier. Miss Clara Brown was nowhere to be seen. And when Miss Marple's gaze moved further, she saw, just for an instant, the young schoolmaster, Peter Linton, slipping away from the fete through the side gate, his face pale and drawn. It was all very sad, of course, but Miss Marple had seen enough fetes, teas, and funerals to know that sadness often walked hand in hand with guilt. As the sun dipped behind the church spire and the village green began to empty, Miss Marple folded her parasol and said quietly to no one in particular, "I dare say this will not be quite so simple as bad baking." And with that, she began to walk home, her mind already turning over the smallest details. The look in Mrs. Rowan's eyes, the trembling of the teapot, the faint smell of almonds that lingered in the summer air. The morning after the Fête Mallicombe was never a village to let silence linger. By the next morning, the entire population, from the vicar's wife to the grocer's boy, had an opinion on the sudden death of Colonel Pembroke. At breakfast tables, in parlours and along the hedgerows, tongues wagged with a kind of solemn excitement. The Colonel, though not universally loved, had been respected. A man of habit, of order, of a faintly pompous dignity that seemed to reassure people that life was as it should be. His sudden death, and at the village fête, no less, had unsettled everyone. At the Bluebell tea-rooms, Mrs. Weatherby was holding court with Mrs. Larchmont and Miss Pearce, both of whom leaned forward eagerly as she whispered, did. And the doctor said it was poison. Cyanide, they think. You can tell by the smell, apparently. Bitter almonds. Terribly ghastly cyanide, gasped Miss Pearce. How dreadful. And at a church event, Mrs. Larchmont shook her head gravely. I always said Colonel Pembroke would come to a dramatic end. There was that business about the inheritance, you know. His nephew expecting to be made heir, and then— nothing. Mrs. Weatherby leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial murmur. Between us, my dear, I think the scones were tampered with, and Mrs. Rowan's been in a state ever since. Of course, her niece vanished halfway through the commotion, didn't she? Indeed she did, said Miss Pearce, her eyes gleaming. And didn't I hear that she was keeping company with that new schoolmaster, the one with the nervous smile and the shabby bicycle? Mr. Linton, supplied Mrs. Larchmont helpfully, lives in the cottage near the mill, quite handsome in a hesitant sort of way. Well, sighed Mrs. Weatherby, sitting back with satisfaction, handsome men have led many a girl into foolishness, and if you ask me, there's always a woman behind a tragedy. At that very moment, the door of the tea-room opened with a small chime, and Miss Marple entered. She was dressed neatly in her soft grey cardigan and hat with a faded blue ribbon. She greeted the trio warmly, and, as always, was welcomed as the one person whose presence gave gossip a certain legitimacy. Such a dreadful thing, she said gently, accepting a cup of tea. Poor Colonel Pembroke. I imagine the doctor and police are working quite hard. Oh, yes, Miss Marple, cried Mrs. Weatherby. Sergeant Webb has been quite thorough. He's already spoken to Mrs. Rowan and searched her kitchen. Can you imagine? Miss Marple stirred her tea, her expression mild. I can imagine he's doing his best, though I should think Mrs. Rowan's pride has suffered more than her conscience. Do you suppose, ventured Miss Pearce hesitantly, That someone really meant to kill the Colonel? Or was it, oh dear, an accident? Miss Marple looked up, her eyes very bright, though her tone was kindly. My dear Miss Pierce, accidents are usually quite simple to prove, and poison, she paused delicately, is a very deliberate thing. There was a brief hush as this sank in. Then, as Miss Marple finished her tea and rose to leave, she said quietly, I always think one learns a great deal from who benefits. And who trembles the most? Later that afternoon, the constable made his way through the village, carrying a basket of confiscated pastries and notes. He looked weary, as though the weight of the evidence was matched only by the burden of gossip. Sergeant Webb had set up his temporary headquarters in the vicar's study, a setting which lent the investigation an unintended air of sanctity. When Miss Marple knocked politely on the door, he greeted her with cautious respect. He had learned, as many officers had before him, that Miss Marple's visits often led to uncomfortable truths. Ah, Miss Marple, I was just reviewing statements, said Webb, gesturing to a table stacked with papers. Poisoned scone seemed straightforward. Mrs. Rowan's batch tested positive for cyanide. We've taken her in for questioning. Miss Marple nodded. Poor woman, she must be quite distraught. Claims she knows nothing about it, said Webb, frowning. Says she used lemon zest and baking soda, same as always. But the chemist says cyanide smells strongly of almonds, which is what several people reported. Must have come from her kitchen somehow. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the back of a chair. Tell me, Sergeant, were all the scones placed out at once, or might someone have exchanged one while the judges were busy elsewhere? Webb blinked. You mean someone tampered with them after she put them out? It's possible, said Miss Marple. In my experience, when one wants to conceal malice, one often hides it in plain sight, among the innocent. She gave him a small, almost grandmotherly smile, then added, If you don't mind, I should like to pay Mrs. Rowan a visit. I always find a bit of kindness brings out what suspicion cannot. And so, while the village of Marleycombe continued to buzz with its theories and half-truths, Miss Marple set off down the cobbled lane toward the Rowan residence, the hem of her skirt brushing against the summer flowers, her face thoughtful and serene behind that calm exterior. However, her mind was sharp and turning, weighing motives, temperaments and timing. She thought of Mrs. Rowan's pride, of the vanished niece, of the young schoolmaster's pale face, and of one faint, persistent memory. The scent of almonds, yes, but mingled with something else. Lemon Marleycombe, that afternoon, Mrs. Rowan's cottage sat just beyond the churchyard, its small windows gleaming in the sun like watchful eyes. The front garden, usually immaculate, looked oddly neglected today. A few withered roses drooping among the lavender. Inside, Miss Marple found the curtains half drawn, and the air heavy with the scent of furniture polish and grief. Mrs. Elspeth Rowan was seated in her armchair, her eyes red and her lace handkerchief clutched tightly in one hand. On the table beside her stood a half-drunk cup of tea, gone cold. "Oh, Miss Marple," she cried as soon as the elderly lady appeared in the doorway. "They've all turned against me. The police, the neighbours, even the vicar's wife looks at me as though I were some wicked poisoner from a penny dreadful." Miss Marple, who had seen this brand of indignation before, part outrage, part fear, took a seat beside her. Now, my dear Mrs. Rowan, you mustn't distress yourself. No one of sense believes you capable of such a cruel act. You have only to tell the truth as you know it." "The truth," Mrs. Rowan sniffed, "is that I made those lemon scones myself, with my own hands. There was nothing unusual in them. Flour, sugar, eggs, butter, lemon zest, a pinch of salt. Nothing else. Clara helped me in the kitchen, of course, but she left before they were baked. Said she had an errand to run. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Your niece, Miss Clara. Where is she now? I didn't see her after the fete. Mrs. Rowan hesitated, pressing the handkerchief to her lips. That's just it, Miss Marple. No one has seen her since yesterday afternoon. Not a word, not a note. Her room is untouched, her bicycle gone. The police think, well, I hardly dare say it. That she's run away, said Miss Marple softly. Mrs. Rowan nodded miserably. But she wouldn't. She's a good girl, truly she is. A little impressionable, perhaps, especially with that Mr. Linton about. But she wouldn't disappear like this. Mr. Linton, said Miss Marple, her tone as mild as ever. The new schoolmaster, yes? I saw him leaving the fete rather quickly after the tragedy. The widow's eyes filled with tears. He and Clara were close, I won't deny it. I told her it wasn't seemly to be keeping company so openly. But young people are reckless, Miss Marple, and Clara. Well, she thought him romantic. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Romance, dear Mrs. Rowan, often confuses bravery with folly. Did she ever speak of any troubles? Money, perhaps? Or something weighing on her mind? Mrs. Rowan shook her head. Nothing of the sort, though. She paused, frowning. Come to think of it, she did seem rather anxious the night before the fete. I found her in the kitchen late, whispering to someone by the back door. When I called out, she jumped like a startled cat. Said it was only the postman, but the post doesn't come after sunset. Curious, murmured Miss Marple. And this morning, no sign of her at all. None. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Then I think I shall have a word with Mr. Linton. A missing young lady and a dead colonel are rarely strangers in such a small place as Marleycombe. The schoolmaster's cottage lay at the edge of the village, shaded by a great chestnut tree. A bicycle leaned against the garden wall, its tires splashed with mud. When Miss Marple knocked, the door opened after a moment, revealing Mr. Peter Linton, pale, hollow-eyed, and visibly shaken. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, voice trembling slightly, "I suppose you've heard. Terrible business, terrible. I can't think who would do such a thing." "Nor can I," she said pleasantly. "But then I imagine the colonel had made a few enemies in his time." Linton hesitated. Perhaps he was. Particular? Yes, about money. He'd lent sums here and there. And he could be cruel, you know, when he thought someone beneath him." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And did he consider you beneath him, Mr. Linton?" He flinched. "He might have. He once hinted that I should mind my ambitions regarding Miss Clara. Said she was far too good for a man of my means." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "That must have hurt." He ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't care about his approval. Clara and I, well, we meant to leave Marleycombe. Go to London, perhaps. She said she'd saved a little. But now she's gone, and I don't know where." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "You expected her to meet you? After the fete?" He looked startled. "Yes, how did you—" "One learns to read faces, Mr. Linton. You were looking for her when you left the green." He said nothing, only swallowed hard. After a moment, Miss Marple sighed gently. "I believe you cared for her, and I believe she trusted you. But trust, my dear, is a fragile thing. If she feared something, or someone, she might have acted in haste. A hasty girl with a secret can do quite desperate things." She gathered her gloves and turned to leave. "If she writes to you, you'll tell the police." Of course, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. As Miss Marple stepped out into the lane, the soft evening light slanting through the trees, she paused. A faint sound caught her ear. The gentle tinkling of a bicycle bell, far down the road toward the mill. She smiled to herself, not with amusement, but with understanding. "Oh dear," she murmured. "I rather think the poor child didn't run away at all." Evening in Marleycombe. The road to the old mill wound gently between hedgerows and meadows, the sort of peaceful lane that poets like to call timeless. But to Miss Marple, nothing in a village was ever truly timeless, only layered. Every path and garden carried the quiet traces of human folly, gossip, and regret. As she walked, the faint chime of the bicycle bell echoed again, not near, but not far either. She followed the sound until she reached the mill pond, where the water gleamed dull gold in the late sunlight. The air was still, heavy with the scent of wild mint and damp wood. The mill itself had long fallen out of use. Its wheels stood crooked against the wall, half sunk in weeds. Children came here to fish for minnows, and couples walked here after dusk. But tonight the place had a different stillness, a kind that seemed to listen. Miss Marple stopped at the edge of the pond, her eyes narrowing. Something caught the light, a metallic glint near the reeds. She stepped closer, careful not to slip on the muddy bank. There, tangled among the rushes, lay a lady's bicycle. Its front wheel was bent, the bell half submerged. Her heart sank a little. It was Clara's bicycle. Miss Marple knelt, brushing her gloved fingers against the handlebar. "Poor child," she whispered. "What have you gone and done?" But she knew instinctively that Clara had not taken a tumble here by accident. The bicycle had been placed, pushed into the pond perhaps, not to hide a crime, but to create the appearance of one. A rustle behind her made her turn. Sergeant Webb had arrived, puffing slightly, his boots heavy with dust. "Miss Marple, what on earth are you doing out here? This is police business now." She smiled faintly. "I dare say it is, but since we both seem to have found the same thing, I thought it best to compare notes before darkness falls." He frowned, bending over the bicycle. "Looks like the girl tried to run away. Lost control on the path, maybe?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No. The front wheel is bent outward, not inward, as though it struck something solid after it was thrown down. And there's no sign of a fall. The grass isn't disturbed. Someone placed it here deliberately," Webb grunted, "to make it look like she'd fled, hiding something worse, perhaps. Possibly. Or perhaps she did run away. But someone wanted us to think she met with an accident instead." The sergeant looked uncertain. "You've a queer way of looking at things, Miss Marple." "I find," she replied serenely, "that truth is often the queerest thing of all." She pointed to a patch of earth by the water's edge. "Do you see there? A footprint, too, in fact. A man's boot, I'd say. Fresh, though not deep. Someone came here last night, after the rain stopped." Webb crouched beside it, muttering. "Could be anyone. Half the men in the village wear boots like that." "True," said Miss Marple, "but few of them are so particular about cleaning them afterward. You'll notice there's no trail away. He must have walked back along the edge of the road, where the ground is harder. Someone careful. Someone who didn't want to leave a mark." The sergeant stood and sighed. "You think she's alive, then?" "I think," said Miss Marple slowly, "that the question of whether she's alive or dead depends very much on who placed that bicycle there. And why. Either way, the story we've been told is not the right one." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat by her window in the quiet of her cottage. The lamplight fell across her knitting, though her hands were still. She was thinking about lemon scones and almond scents, about a frightened girl whispering in the dark, about a proud aunt and a schoolmaster with the look of a hunted man. She took out her notebook, a modest little thing bound in blue cloth, and wrote 3 neat lines. The Colonel, cyanide, Mrs. Rowan, proud, careless of detail. Clara, missing, bicycle staged, someone she feared. Then, after a pause, she added a fourth, Peter Linton, not afraid for himself, but for her. A gentle knock came at the door. It was Dr. Graham, hat in hand, his face grave. "Evening, Miss Marple. I thought I'd best tell you before it spreads. They've dragged the pond." She looked up sharply, and he hesitated. "No body, not a sign of the girl." Miss Marple's lips pursed, not in surprise, but in confirmation. "No," she said softly. "I rather thought they wouldn't find her there." Dr. Graham frowned. "You believe she's alive, then?" "Oh, quite possibly," said Miss Marple. "But if she is, she's in very grave danger, because whoever poisoned the Colonel will not wish her found. Not until it's too late." Outside, the church bell tolled 8. The sound drifted across the village, steady, mournful, and strange. Miss Marple sat back, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "The truth," she murmured, "has begun to stir the water, and I suspect it won't rest quietly again until it's seen daylight. Marleycombe, the following morning." The next morning dawned soft and grey, a thin mist curling through the hedges and clinging to the thatched roofs. From her sitting-room window, Miss Marple watched the village stir to life. Milk cart on the lane, postman at his steady round, the faint ring of the church bell calling the devout few to morning prayers. Life in Marleycombe, outwardly at least, had resumed its calm rhythm. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that such calm was a mask. And beneath it, tempests brewed. She set aside her teacup and hatched a plan. There was one person who knew more than he dared to tell, and she meant to have it out of him. Gently, of course. At 10 o'clock precisely, she walked up the path to the schoolhouse. The building stood on a rise, its ivy-covered walls glistening with dew. Inside, she found Mr. Linton alone at his desk, staring at a stack of unmarked papers. He looked up startled when she entered. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting—" "Nor should you," she said pleasantly, removing her gloves. "I find unannounced visits often reveal more than invitations do. You've had a trying few days, I dare say." He gave a short, nervous laugh. "That's putting it mildly. The whole village looks at me as if well, you know." "As if you've something to hide?" He flinched slightly, then sighed. "I suppose I do. But not what they think." Miss Marple sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Then perhaps you should tell me the truth. It often lightens the conscience, even if it complicates the story." He hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Clara came to me the night before the fête. She was frightened. She'd overheard something about the Colonel. Said she'd stumbled on a letter meant for him, one that never should have existed." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A letter, you say? And from whom?" "She didn't tell me at first, only that it had to do with money. And some arrangement the Colonel had made years ago, before he came to Marleycombe. A woman, she said, someone from his time in Ceylon." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Ah, yes. The tropics have a way of returning to haunt even the most English of men." Linton ran a hand through his hair. She wanted to give it to the police, but she was afraid it would ruin her aunt. The Colonel had been lending money quietly, to Mrs. Rowan, among others. Clara thought the letter might prove he'd been blackmailing people in the village, or that someone had been blackmailing him. She didn't quite know which. "And she came to you for advice?" "Yes. I told her to bring me the letter in the morning, before the fête. But she didn't. I waited, and then—" He looked away. "You know the rest." Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. "This letter. Where might she have found it?" in the Colonel's coat pocket. She was helping his housekeeper mend a tear. Said she couldn't resist peeking when it fell out. How very human of her, Miss Marple murmured. Curiosity is often the prelude to discovery, and sometimes to danger. He nodded miserably. She mentioned a name too, only once. Headley. Does that mean anything to you? Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Headley, Headley. She tapped her chin thoughtfully. There was a Captain Headley in Ceylon during the Colonel's service there, I believe. A scandal of some kind. Smuggling or misappropriation of funds. But it was hushed up. The Colonel must have known more than was convenient. You think the letter proved it? Perhaps. And if someone in this village knew it still existed, that might explain a good deal. Mr. Linton leaned forward, his voice low and tense. Miss Marple, if Clara still has that letter, if she's hiding somewhere, she could be in terrible danger. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. Indeed, which is why we must find her first. Tell me, Mr. Linton, was there anyone else who knew about the letter? He hesitated. Only Mrs. Rowan. Clara told her she'd found something about the Colonel, but not what. Her aunt warned her to keep silent, said stirring up the past would bring trouble to the family. And yet, said Miss Marple softly, trouble arrived anyway, in the form of a poisoned scone. He looked at her sharply. You don't think Mrs. Rowan? Miss Marple raised a gloved hand. No, no, my dear. Mrs. Rowan may have many faults. Pride, temper, an alarming fondness for self-importance. But murder is not among them. Still, her household might not have been as private as she supposed. A bell rang distantly. The noon hour. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. You've been most helpful, Mr. Linton, she said. If Clara trusted you, then she may still try to reach you. Should you receive any word, you must tell me at once. Or the police, if you prefer. But be careful what you tell Sergeant Webb. He's a good man, but not a subtle one. He managed a faint smile. And you, Miss Marple, what will you do? Oh, nothing exciting, she said lightly. Just a quiet visit to the late Colonel's house. I have a fondness for sorting through old letters. Particularly the kind people would rather forget. That afternoon, as Miss Marple walked up the gravel path to Colonel Pembroke's residence, she reflected on the curious symmetry of it all. A poisoned man, a vanished girl, and a letter from a tropical scandal that refused to die. She was greeted by Mrs. Dane, the Colonel's loyal housekeeper, a thin woman with grey hair and wary eyes. "So dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, ushering her in. "I can hardly believe it. The Colonel, gone like that. He was so particular, so orderly. Why, he even left a drawer labelled Private Correspondence." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Did he indeed? And might one see it purely in the interest of tidiness? Mrs. Dane hesitated, but Miss Marple's manner was disarming. More that of a kindly aunt than an investigator. With a small sigh, she led her to the study. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper. On the desk sat a stack of letters bound with twine. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and glanced over the topmost envelope. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, and the signature unmistakable, E. Headley. She smiled faintly, her pulse quickening. "Ah," she murmured, "so the past does write home after all." But her satisfaction was brief, for beneath the bundle of letters lay something else. A small scrap of torn paper, scrawled in Clara Rowan's neat hand. It read, "If anything happens, he must never find the rest. Not until it's safe." Miss Marple straightened slowly, her mind already assembling the pieces, and though the room was still and silent, she suddenly had the peculiar feeling that she was not alone. The days following Mrs. Larchmont's funeral were marked by an uneasy stillness in Willowbrook. Life, in its English way, insisted on resuming. The postman's bicycle creaked along the lane again, the shop bell tinkled with the purchase of tea and bread, and the vicar's wife resumed her flower rota at the church. Yet beneath that thin veneer of normality, there was an unmistakable current of apprehension. Whispers followed every cup poured in the Rosehill tea-rooms. Conversations fell silent whenever Inspector Craythorne passed by, his hat pulled low and his notebook ever at the ready. And through it all, Miss Marple, with her delicate lace shawl and mild smile, moved as if through a garden of secrets, quietly gathering what others overlooked. She was visiting Mrs. Finch, the grocer's wife, that Tuesday morning. Mrs. Finch prided herself on knowing every crumb that passed through the village, and she had opinions on the murder that would have filled an entire police dossier. Had anyone asked for it? It's all too dreadful. Miss Marple, she said, weighing out sugar into a brown paper bag. They say that poor woman was poisoned, and by her own food. Imagine lemon scones. I said to Mr. Finch, that's what comes of taking tea at other people's houses. You never know what's in their larder. Miss Marple smiled mildly. Indeed, Mrs. Finch, one never quite does. Mrs. Finch leaned forward conspiratorially. I'll tell you what I think. That niece of hers, Miss Clara, always looked a bit shifty to me, pretending to be all devoted. But she was the one to gain, wasn't she? The house, the little bit of money left. And she was the one who baked those scones, wasn't she? Perhaps, said Miss Marple, her tone gentle, her eyes thoughtful, though I dare say one should not assume guilt merely from proximity. Poison, after all, requires planning, and planning requires a certain temperament. Mrs. Finch sniffed. Temperament or not, there's something not right in that house. Always was. Mr. Larchmont, God rest him, drank more than he should. And that maid, Mabel, wasn't it? Well, she's the one I'd keep an eye on. You never know with that class. They see more than they ought, and sooner or later they talk. Miss Marple tucked away that observation neatly. She had learned long ago that gossip, like crumbs, could lead one to the truth, provided one knew which were worth following. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Larchmont residence. It was quieter now. The police had come and gone, and Clara Larchmont was attempting, rather unsuccessfully, to resume her routine. She looked pale, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. But she greeted Miss Marple with gratitude. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's kind of you to call. Everyone looks at me as if I've done something dreadful. I can't even go into the village without hearing whispers." "I can quite imagine, my dear," said Miss Marple, taking a seat by the hearth. "But one mustn't let gossip rule one's peace of mind. The truth has a way of coming out eventually." Clara sighed. "If only the police would see that I couldn't have done it. Aunt had enemies, though she wouldn't admit it. There was that quarrel with Mr. Giles over the garden wall, and Mrs. Pembroke's threats about the will." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Ah, the will. I wondered about that. Such matters often bring out curious emotions." Clara hesitated. "Aunt changed it not long ago. Left most of it to me, but also, strangely, a small sum to someone called E.T. I've no idea who that could be." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in mid-air. "E.T., you say? How intriguing!" That evening, in her little parlour with its neatly pressed curtains and scent of lavender, Miss Marple reflected on the initials. Names drifted through her mind like petals in a teacup. Emma? Edward? Elsie? Ernest? So many possibilities. Yet her instincts told her that those two letters, modest as they seemed, held the key to something far deeper. For in her long experience, Miss Marple had learned one immutable truth. In every village, beneath the politeness and the roses, the past is never truly gone. It lingers. In debts unpaid, in secrets whispered, and in initials carved on old letters best forgotten. She folded her hands quietly in her lap, her eyes distant and calm. "E.T.," she murmured to herself. "Now that's a thread worth pulling." And outside, under the dim glow of the street lamps, a figure paused near her garden gate, watching, waiting, before disappearing silently into the fog. The dawn that broke over Willowbrook 2 days later was pale and uneasy. A thin mist clung to the hedgerows, muffling sound and dulling colour, so that the village seemed to drift in some half-forgotten dream. Only the sound of distant church bells marked the hour, a sombre reminder that time, and perhaps fate, moved ever forward. Miss Marple, having finished her morning tea, was tending to her geraniums when she heard the sound of hurried footsteps on the path outside. It was young Tommy Briggs, the errand boy from the grocer's, his face red with exertion and eyes wide as saucers. "Miss Marple, ma'am. It's happened again. At the vicarage. They've sent for the police." She looked up, serene yet alert. "Again, you say? And at the vicarage?" "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Pritchard, the church treasurer, they found him. Well, dead. In the vestry." For a heartbeat, Miss Marple said nothing. Then, with a faint sigh, she laid down her pruning shears. "Oh dear," she said softly. "How very inconvenient for Sunday services." Within the hour, the village was buzzing once more, the very air thick with speculation. People gathered in doorways, exchanged theories at the bakery, and peeked from behind lace curtains as Inspector Craythorne's motor car rolled grimly through the square. Miss Marple, walking slowly toward the vicarage, was greeted by the vicar's wife, a plump, flustered woman whose composure was clearly in tatters. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. Poor Mr. Pritchard, struck down right in the Lord's house. The doctor says it was heart failure, but the inspector doesn't think so. He had a cup of tea on the table beside him, and a half-eaten lemon scone." "Lemon scone?" Miss Marple repeated mildly, as though remarking upon a change in the weather. The vicar's wife nodded, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Yes, brought over yesterday from the same batch Miss Clara had baked for Mrs. Larchmont's tea. She'd given a few to the church as a peace offering," she said. "Imagine." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes, imagine." Inside the vestry, the scene was painfully neat. The small room smelled faintly of polish and lilies. Mr. Pritchard lay slumped beside the table, his spectacles crooked, the teacups shattered on the floor. Inspector Craythorne stood nearby, grim and businesslike. "Ah, Miss Marple, I might have known you'd appear." "One tries to be of service," she replied, "though I fear I shan't be of much use if I tread on anything important." He gave her a weary look. "You might say what you think of this, then. 2 deaths, same sort of food, same circle of acquaintances. You'll tell me I'm wrong, but I'm beginning to see a pattern." Miss Marple bent slightly, her eyes taking in the smallest details. The overturned chair, the faint trace of sugar on the table, the clean teapot with its recently polished spout. "A pattern, yes," she said softly, "but perhaps not the one you expect, Inspector," he frowned. "Meaning?" She smiled vaguely. "Oh, merely that, in human affairs, the pattern often lies not in what is seen, but in what has been assumed. For instance, who poured the tea? Who baked the scones? And most curiously, who benefited from Mr. Pritchard's passing?" That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll along the lane toward the churchyard, her mind a steady hum of recollection. She remembered how Mrs. Larchmont had quarrelled with Mr. Pritchard about parish funds only a week before her death. She remembered, too, the initials E.T. in the will, and how easily a name might be hidden in plain sight. A breeze lifted her scarf as she paused before a weathered gravestone. "People do forget," she murmured, "but the past, my dear Jane, never quite forgets them." As she turned to leave, she noticed something half buried near the churchyard gate. A scrap of linen, torn, faintly stained with something dark. She bent down and picked it up carefully, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Oh dear," she whispered, tucking the fabric into her handbag. "I do believe this village is far from finished with its troubles." And as the evening settled over Willowbrook, a light flickered in the vicarage window, a figure moving swiftly behind the curtain. While Miss Marple, safe in her cottage, prepared another cup of tea and reached for her notebook, the pieces were beginning to fit. But one piece, the most dangerous of all, was still missing. A soft rain fell over Willowbrook the next morning, veiling the village in a silvery hush. The world seemed gentler under the mist, the hedgerows beaded with droplets, the cobblestones slick and gleaming, the chimneys breathing pale smoke into the grey air. Yet beneath that tranquil veil, Miss Marple felt the tension of something tightening, unseen but inevitable. She was seated at her small writing desk, a cup of tea cooling beside her, when a knock sounded at the door. When she opened it, Inspector Craythorne stood there, looking less sure of himself than usual. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Thought I'd drop by, if you've got a moment." She smiled mildly. "Of course, Inspector. You'll take some tea?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, but no lemon, if you please." A shadow of amusement flickered in Miss Marple's eyes. Quite understandable. Once he was settled in the parlour, the fire crackling cheerfully, a faint scent of lavender in the air. Craythorne leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I've gone through Mrs. Larchmont's effects. There's something odd I think you'll want to see." From his coat pocket he withdrew a small envelope, yellowed with age, the flap unsealed. He passed it to her. Inside lay a folded letter, the ink faded but legible. The writing was neat, deliberate, and signed with those same initials. E.T. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and began to read. "My dearest Margaret, I cannot thank you enough for what you've done, though I know it has cost you dearly. The money will see me through the next few months and perhaps beyond. If I can make it right, I shall return to you. Until then, please keep my name from their lips. You've always been my dearest friend. Yours ever, Edward Talmage." Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. "Edward Talmage." Craythorne nodded. "Name mean anything to you?" "As a matter of fact, yes," she said slowly. "I recall hearing it long ago. He worked as a clerk for the parish trust, did he not? There was some unfortunate scandal about missing funds." "That's right," said Craythorne grimly. "He disappeared not long after. Never charged, never seen again. Mrs. Larchmont was a benefactor of the parish in those days. Seems she lent him money before he fled." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. So the E.T. in her will may not have been an unknown at all, but a conscience long unquiet. Perhaps she meant to make amends, or to remind someone else of what was owed. Craythorne frowned. "But what's the connection to these murders? Talmage has been gone 20 years. "Gone," said Miss Marple softly, "is not always the same as forgotten, especially in a village." The inspector sighed and rose to his feet. "You always speak in riddles, Miss Marple, but I'll grant you, this business smells of something old, something that's been festering." After he left, Miss Marple sat for a long while, turning the letter over in her hands. Edward Talmage, a man disgraced and vanished. Mrs. Larchmont, a woman who'd forgiven, or perhaps paid for silence. And now, 2 deaths tied by lemon scones and a whisper of the past. She rose and crossed to her bookshelf, where an old parish almanac rested. Leafing through the brittle pages, she found the entry she sought. Edward Talmage, clerk to the parish fund. Resigned 1931. Beneath it, in tidy pencil, a note had been added, succeeded by Harold Pritchard. Miss Marple closed the book with a soft thud. "Ah," she said aloud, "so that's the link. 2 men, 1 secret, and perhaps a promise never kept." That afternoon she called upon Clara Larchmont. The young woman was pale and jittery, the strain of suspicion wearing at her composure. "I'm so frightened, Miss Marple," Clara said, twisting a handkerchief. "The inspector keeps hinting. I don't even know what he suspects me of any more." "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "people often suspect what they fear most in themselves. But tell me, have you ever heard the name Edward Talmage?" Clara blinked. "Talmage? No, though Aunt once mentioned someone by that name, years ago. She said he disappointed her. I think she helped him, but he betrayed her somehow." "Yes," murmured Miss Marple, her gaze gentle. "It seems betrayal lingers longer than friendship in places like this." She rose, smoothing her gloves. "I believe, my dear, that the answers we seek lie not in what was done recently, but in what was left unfinished 20 years ago." And as Miss Marple stepped out into the rain-silvered street, she caught sight of a figure at the end of the lane. A tall man in a dark coat, watching her intently before vanishing around the corner. She stood for a moment unmoving, then drew her shawl tighter. "So," she murmured, "the past does have a face, after all." The rain had ceased by nightfall, leaving the streets of Willowbrook shining faintly beneath the glow of the gas lamps. A mist still clung to the hedges, curling along the lane like a cat seeking warmth. From her cottage window, Miss Marple could see the church spire rising black against the dim sky, and beneath it the same figure she had glimpsed earlier that afternoon. Tall, solitary, and oddly still. She watched him for some minutes, unseen behind the curtain lace, before he turned and disappeared toward the old rectory road. Her instincts, finely honed by years of quiet observation, told her that he was not simply a curious villager. There was a deliberateness to his walk, the steady pace of someone returning to familiar ground. After a thoughtful pause, Miss Marple fetched her shawl and hat. "If one waits for the truth to come knocking," she murmured, "one often waits in vain." The night air was cool, filled with the scent of wet earth and the faint rustle of trees. She followed the lane at a careful distance until the figure came into view again. Halted now near the low stone wall of the churchyard. He was lighting a cigarette, his face briefly illuminated by the flame. It was a face she did not know. Lined, weary, yet oddly distinguished. The kind of face that had seen far too much and spoken far too little. "Good evening," Miss Marple said softly. The man started, the cigarette dropping from his fingers. "Good Lord, you startled me, madam." "I do apologize," she said, her tone gentle. "I often walk this way before bed. The air is so very clear after rain." He hesitated, then gave a stiff nod. "Indeed, a fine evening for reflection. You're not from Willowbrook, are you?" she asked. "I make it a point to know everyone in the parish." A faint smile touched his lips. "No, ma'am, I used to be long ago." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him. "Then you'll know the church well." And perhaps the vicarage, too. He looked away. Too well, there was a silence. The distant clock struck 9. Somewhere a dog barked. "You'll forgive an old woman's curiosity," Miss Marple said mildly, "but I do so dislike unsolved mysteries. You see, there's been rather a lot of excitement in Willowbrook lately. Deaths, letters, initials, and it's so seldom that strangers appear in the midst of such excitement." The man gave a quiet, humourless laugh. "Then perhaps I should reintroduce myself. My name, Miss Marple, is Edward Talmage." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as though greeting an expected guest. "Ah," she said, "I rather thought it might be." He stared at her, wary now. "Then you know?" "I know you were once the parish clerk," she said softly, "and that Mrs. Larchmont once helped you when no one else would. I know she left something for you in her will, a gesture, perhaps, of forgiveness. But what I do not yet know, Mr. Talmage, is why you've come back now." He drew a long breath. His eyes clouded. "I didn't kill her, if that's what you mean. God knows I wronged her once, but never that way. I came back because she wrote to me weeks ago, said she was ill, and wanted to put things right before she died." Miss Marple's expression softened. "And did she?" He shook his head. "No. By the time I reached the village, she was gone, and now they say she was murdered." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "And another soon after." His gaze snapped to her. "Another?" "The church treasurer," she said quietly. "Mr. Pritchard." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a bitter laugh, "That's ironic, isn't it? He was the one who took the rest. The money I was blamed for. He covered his own thefts by ruining me." Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "So there was a quarrel between you?" "There was no chance for one," he said. "I left before he could speak, but when I saw his name again on the parish board, well, I might have wished him to answer for what he'd done. But I swear, Miss Marple, I never touched the man." She believed him, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. With that worn honesty of someone who has carried guilt so long, it no longer needs to be performed. Still, she noted quietly, "Your arrival coincides most unfortunately with 2 sudden deaths." He gave a low, humourless sigh. "Then I suppose I'd best go before I'm blamed again." "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple. "Leaving would only make things worse. You see, Mr. Talmage, the truth is already circling, and it has a way of catching those who run from it." She looked toward the church, where a single light burned faintly through the vestry window. "If you truly wish to clear your name, I suggest you stay. The past has a strange way of insisting on resolution, whether we wish it or not." Talmage studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. Most would have turned me in by now." "Oh," she said with a small smile, "I find confession much more reliable than accusation." As she walked home through the quiet mist, Miss Marple felt the weight of revelation settle upon her. Edward Talmage's return was no coincidence. It was the last echo of an old sin finally demanding its reckoning. And yet, somewhere beyond the lamplit lane, another pair of eyes watched her. Colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. By morning, the rain had passed, and Willowbrook looked deceptively peaceful again. Sunlight filtering through the chestnut trees, the postman whistling down the lane, and Mrs. Finch already hanging out her washing, as though murder were a temporary inconvenience. But beneath the calm, something was stirring. A rumour, sharp as a knife, had begun to circulate through the village. That Edward Talmage, the disgraced parish clerk who vanished 20 years ago, had returned, and worse, that he had been seen near both crime scenes. Miss Marple heard it first from her milkman. "Back from the dead, they say, ma'am. Walking about at night near the churchyard. Gives one the shivers, it does. And if you ask me, he's the one as done it." Miss Marple, tying her shawl with practised composure, merely replied, "Ah, yes, people do so enjoy a good resurrection, especially when it comes with scandal." Still, she knew exactly where the rumour had begun, and why. Someone wanted Edward Talmadge blamed, someone clever enough to understand that an old ghost made for an easy villain. That afternoon, she walked up the narrow path to the vicarage, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes. Inside, Inspector Craythorne was already waiting, his brow furrowed and his temper shorter than usual. "Ah, Miss Marple, you've heard, I expect. Talmadge has shown his face again. Seems he's been lurking about the village for days." "I rather think he's been looking for forgiveness, not mischief," said Miss Marple mildly. Craythorne snorted. "Forgiveness? He's up to his neck in it now." The moment his name was whispered, half the village came running to identify him. And what's worse, we found something near the vestry. A scrap of cloth with his initials stitched inside. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Really? How? Convenient." The inspector frowned. "Convenient? My dear inspector," she said, seating herself with quiet authority, "have you never noticed how murderers, like children, tend to overdo their lessons? When something seems too easily found, one ought to ask who placed it there." He hesitated, then muttered, "You're thinking it's a frame-up?" "I'm thinking," said Miss Marple gently, "that the person who killed Mrs. Larchmont had knowledge of both her household and her history. And now, with Mr. Pritchard gone, only two people remain who truly understood the matter of Edward Talmadge's disgrace. Talmadge himself, and someone who profited from keeping it buried." The inspector rubbed his chin. "You mean someone else in the parish? Perhaps, or someone rather nearer home." A knock interrupted them. The vicar's wife entered, pale and fluttering. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I've just come from the church. There's been the most dreadful discovery. In the donation box, a small bottle, labelled arsenic. The room went still. Who had access to the church this morning?" Miss Marple asked quietly. The vicar's wife wrung her hands. "Only the verger and Miss Clara Larchmont. She came to speak with me about the flowers." Craythorne swore under his breath. "That settles it. She's trying to shift suspicion from herself. First the poisoned scones, now this." But Miss Marple's expression did not change. Her eyes, calm and knowing, rested on the window. "No, Inspector," she said at last. "It settles something else entirely. We are being led, quite purposefully, toward the wrong conclusion." That evening, Miss Marple invited Inspector Craythorne to tea at her cottage. He arrived with a grim expression, clearly expecting an argument. Instead, she served him hot tea and shortbread, chatting gently until his guard began to soften. "Inspector," she said at last, "what do you know of Mrs. Pembroke?" "The neighbour?" He shrugged. "Feisty old sort, always complaining about the Larchmont garden." "What of her?" "She was also Mr. Pritchard's cousin," Miss Marple said, "and the sole witness who swore against Edward Talmadge when the parish money disappeared. Curiously, her own accounts were never audited, and her late husband was treasurer before Mr. Pritchard took over." Craythorne's brows knit. "Are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," said Miss Marple quietly, "that whoever killed Mrs. Larchmont and Mr. Pritchard is not a man, but a woman, and one who understood that their shared secret could not remain hidden once Edward Talmadge returned." The inspector sat back, astonished. "You mean Mrs. Pembroke?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I mean to say, dear Inspector, that some women are far better at murder than men. They tidy up after themselves." He stared at her, then gave a slow, reluctant nod. "You're setting a trap, aren't you?" Her eyes twinkled. merely inviting someone for tea. And as she poured the last of the pot, she murmured almost to herself, "Poisoners, you see, have a dreadful weakness. They never resist watching others drink." Outside, the church bell tolled softly through the dusk, as though marking the beginning of an end. The next afternoon arrived wrapped in a deceptive calm. A golden October day, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves and the faint smoke of burning wood. In St. Mary Mead, such days were made for gossip in the garden, for pruning roses, and for pretending that darkness didn't linger behind lace curtains. Miss Marple's cottage looked charming as ever, teacups polished, fire crackling, and a delicate sponge cake resting on the table as though the world were perfectly innocent. But beneath that gentle domesticity lay a quiet tension, a stillness that spoke of expectation. At precisely 4 o'clock, there came a knock at the door. "Do come in, Mrs. Pembroke," Miss Marple called, her voice as warm as the teapot waiting beside her. Mrs. Pembroke entered briskly, cheeks flushed from the walk, her hat tilted at a sharp angle, as if to remind the world she was not a woman easily trifled with. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Such dreadful business in the village, isn't it? I do hope you're keeping well through it all." "Quite well, thank you," said Miss Marple with a smile. "I find that a cup of tea soothes the nerves beautifully. Don't you agree?" Mrs. Pembroke sat, her gloved hands fussing with the teaspoon. "Indeed, though I dare say I've needed more than one these past few days. That poor Mrs. Larchmont. And now, Mr. Pritchard, it's enough to make one question the goodness of mankind." Miss Marple poured the tea carefully, her eyes never leaving her guest's face. Yes, such good people, both of them, though not without their complicated histories. Mrs. Pembroke's hand froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Miss Marple to notice. "Complicated?" she repeated lightly. "I shouldn't think so. Mrs. Larchmont was a pillar of society." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied gently, "as was Mr. Pritchard, though one might say both stood upon rather shaky ground, given what they knew of the old Talmadge affair." A silence settled between them. The ticking of the clock grew loud. Outside a thrush sang somewhere near the hedge. Then Mrs. Pembroke gave a short, brittle laugh. "Oh, that old nonsense! Why, it's ancient history." "I do wonder," said Miss Marple, leaning just slightly forward, "how it feels to carry such history alone. After all, poor Edward Talmadge was ruined by those accusations, and only one person truly benefited from his disgrace." Mrs. Pembroke's teacup rattled against the saucer. "You're implying something dreadful, Miss Marple." "Not at all, my dear. I'm merely observing. You see, people often imagine crimes are committed for passion or revenge, but more often they're done to preserve comfort. A nice home, a good reputation, a quiet village life." Mrs. Pembroke set her cup down sharply. "This is absurd." "I dare say," Miss Marple said softly. "It must have been rather inconvenient when Mrs. Larchmont began threatening to confess what really happened to the parish funds, and when Mr. Pritchard refused to keep silent any longer." "Stop it!" "Well, then the poison must have seemed like such a tidy solution." Mrs. Pembroke rose to her feet, trembling. "You've no proof. You're just an old busybody who pokes about in other people's affairs." Miss Marple did not flinch. "Oh, but I have proof, Mrs. Pembroke. You see, I asked my housekeeper to prepare 2 identical teapots this afternoon. Only one was poured with your special blend, the same you delivered so kindly to Mrs. Larchmont last week." For the first time, genuine fear crossed Mrs. Pembroke's face. You wouldn't dare." The front door opened suddenly. Inspector Craythorne stepped inside, his gaze cold and certain. "We dare," he said. "And we've already tested the tea you gave Miss Marple. Arsenic, same as the residue found in the church box." Mrs. Pembroke's composure cracked. She sank into the chair, shaking her head in disbelief. "She was going to ruin everything," she whispered hoarsely. "All those years of respectability. Gone. I couldn't let her destroy me. I just couldn't." Miss Marple watched her quietly, almost sadly. "I do understand, Mrs. Pembroke. Appearances are a dreadful burden, aren't they? But I'm afraid the truth has a way of showing itself, no matter how neatly one folds the napkin over it." As Craythorne led her out into the dusk, Mrs. Pembroke's heels clicked on the path like the final tolls of a funeral bell. When they were gone, Miss Marple sat alone by the fire, the teacups cooling between them. She sighed softly and murmured, "There now, another storm past, though I dare say the rain will come again soon." Outside, the first drops had already begun to fall. The rain had not stopped for 2 days. It fell in a slow, sorrowful rhythm, soaking the cobbled lanes of St. Mary Mead and turning the hedgerows to glistening emerald walls. The village seemed hushed, subdued, as though unwilling to speak of what had happened. Curtains stayed drawn longer than usual. Conversations ended abruptly when someone entered the room, and every time Miss Marple walked down the lane, faces turned quickly away, pretending to admire shop windows or post letters that didn't exist. It was not cruelty that kept them silent. It was shock, for Mrs. Pembroke's arrest had been like the dropping of a stone into a still pond, and the ripples had reached every doorstep. She had been respected, admired even. To think her capable of murder, and such cold, deliberate murder, unsettled them all. Miss Marple, however, was not unsettled. She moved about her cottage with her usual precision, trimming the roses, writing her correspondence, and keeping her fire well fed against the damp. Yet there was a faint melancholy in her eyes, a kind of tired sorrow that came from understanding too much of human frailty. On the 3rd morning after the arrest, Inspector Craythorne paid her a visit. He looked as though he hadn't slept much, a fact Miss Marple noted immediately from the unpolished boots and faint shadow on his chin. "You look worn out, Inspector," she said kindly, pouring him a cup of tea before he had even sat down. "Lemon or milk?" "Milk, thank you." He sighed heavily as he accepted the cup. "It's been a queer case, Miss Marple. All seems straightforward now, though I can't help but feel uneasy." "Ah," she murmured, stirring her own cup. "Uneasy feelings are very often the soul's way of telling us something's not quite as tidy as it appears." Craythorne leaned forward. "We found the arsenic in her pantry in a tin labelled cleaning powder. She's confessed to both murders. There's no question she did it. And yet," Miss Marple looked up over her spectacles. "You're thinking of motive," he nodded. "Yes, her reasons, they don't quite add up. She said she killed Mrs. Larchmont to stop her revealing an old embezzlement, and Pritchard because he was about to expose her. But according to the records, the sums were repaid quietly years ago. No one ever pressed charges. Why kill now?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because, Inspector, fear doesn't fade simply because the facts do. Guilt is a creature that sleeps lightly. The smallest whisper can wake it." Craythorne considered this. "You're saying she acted out of fear, not greed?" "Precisely. Fear of losing her good name, her friends, her place in the village. You see, in St. Mary Mead, reputation is as precious as life itself, and Mrs. Pembroke had built hers upon sand." The inspector drank in silence for a moment, staring at the dancing flames in the hearth. "Still," he said finally, "there's something missing. I can't help thinking she wasn't the only one keeping secrets." Miss Marple's smile deepened, not of amusement, but of quiet approval. "Very perceptive of you, Inspector. I was wondering when you might come to that conclusion." He looked startled. "You mean there's more?" "Oh, my dear man," she said softly, "in a village like this, there's always more. But some truths do no good by being told. Justice, I believe, has already taken the course it must, and perhaps that's quite enough." Craythorne frowned, but did not press her further. There was something in her voice, a calm certainty that discouraged argument. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat a long while by the window, watching the rain fall against the glass. In the distance, she could just make out the church tower rising above the mist, the bell silent for now. She thought of Mrs. Pembroke, sitting alone in her cell, clutching at the shreds of her dignity. She thought of Mrs. Larchmont, whose ambition had been as poisonous as the tea she drank, and she thought of all the other villagers, the gossips, the kind-hearted souls, the liars, and the innocents, each playing their part in the endless human comedy. At last, she sighed and whispered to herself, "It's a pity, really, so much cleverness spent on concealment, when a little truth might have saved them all." Outside, the rain eased, the clouds thinned, and a narrow blade of sunlight pierced through, glinting off the wet cobblestones like a promise of peace. Miss Marple rose, folded her knitting neatly on the chair, and went to put the kettle on again. There would, she decided, always be another storm some day, but for now it was time for tea. A week later, the sky above St. Mary Mead was a clear, untroubled blue. The rain had washed away the grime and whispers. The village looked almost reborn, fresh laundered and quietly contrite. The church bells rang again, slow and steady, as if the very air were reminding people that life, however shaken, must go on. Mrs. Pembroke had been taken away 2 days prior. The newspapers called it the Lemon Scone poisoning, a name that made Miss Marple wince every time she saw it. They spoke of tragedy and deceit, of the terrible betrayal of a woman once loved by all. But in St. Mary Mead itself, the scandal was softening into story, the sort of story one lowers one's voice to tell after tea. At the Blue Finch tea shop, Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell were already at it. "I said from the start she was too well groomed," Miss Hartnell declared, spooning sugar with righteous vigour. Always thought herself above everyone else. "Well, pride goeth before destruction, doesn't it?" Mrs. Price Ridley nodded sagely. "And to think we used to eat her lemon scones every fete. Dreadful, isn't it? Dreadful." Outside, Miss Marple passed by the window, her face reflected briefly between their gossiping profiles. She smiled faintly to herself and moved on. Her destination was the churchyard, where the low autumn sun painted the stones in gentle amber. She carried a small posy of white daisies, not for Mrs. Larchmont, nor for poor Mr. Pritchard, but for the memory of something quieter. Peace disturbed, and now, perhaps, restored. Reverend Clement met her at the gate. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said kindly. "I hardly know what to say about all this business. Quite dreadful. But I suppose even the fairest gardens have their weeds." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly, "and one mustn't blame the garden for a weed's nature. Only tend it more carefully." He nodded thoughtfully, then went to greet a parishioner. Miss Marple lingered by the lich gate, her eyes drawn to the bench beneath the old yew tree, the very spot where, weeks ago, she'd first overheard Mrs. Pembroke and Mrs. Larchmont in heated discussion. Now it was empty. Only a few leaves rustled across the seat, chasing one another like fragments of a secret long spent. As she stood there, she noticed a familiar figure approaching, Mr. Hawthorne, the apothecary. He tipped his hat nervously. "Good day, Miss Marple. I heard about your assistance in the matter. Very fine work, if I may say." "Oh, not at all," she said modestly. "I merely listen to people, that's all. One hears so much if one only lets them talk." He hesitated, then added, "Still, I can't help but think Mrs. Pembroke didn't buy that arsenic from me. Not recently, anyway. The batch the police found was quite old. Strange, isn't it?" Miss Marple looked at him, her eyes twinkling just a little. "Very strange indeed. Perhaps some things are better left." Comfortably explained, he looked puzzled. "You mean—" But she was already walking away, her parasol tapping lightly on the path. Back home, her fire was lit and her tea laid out. A comforting ritual as sacred as any prayer. She sliced herself a small piece of lemon scone, spread a thin layer of clotted cream, and sat down with a sigh of contentment. On the table beside her lay a folded note, Inspector Craythorne's handwriting. It read simply, "Case closed. Pembroke's confession holds. Thank you, Miss Marple. We owe you more than we can say." Miss Marple smiled at the words for a long moment. Then, with a faint sigh, she tucked the note into her sewing basket. Not as a keepsake, but as something best kept out of sight. For in her heart she knew one last truth. Mrs. Pembroke had indeed poisoned Mrs. Larchmont, but not Mr. Pritchard. That act, Miss Marple suspected, belonged to another hand entirely. Someone who had realized that Pritchard's death would tie the bow neatly, sealing guilt around the wrong person and leaving themselves untouched. But Miss Marple had no intention of speaking it aloud. The dead were buried, and the living, those who carried small, terrible secrets, would have to live with what they'd done. As the afternoon light faded into gold, she poured her tea and raised her cup gently toward the empty chair across from her. "To peace," she whispered, "and to knowing when enough truth is enough." Outside the church bell rang once more, steady and calm, and in the quiet little village of St. Mary Mead, life at last went on. Evening had settled gently over St. Mary Mead, painting the rooftops in lavender and gold. The air smelled of damp leaves and chimney smoke, the faint perfume of an English autumn winding toward its quiet rest. In cottages all across the village, lamps glowed behind lace curtains, and supper tables were being laid. Life, as Miss Marple had often observed, has a remarkable way of continuing, even after truth has shaken it to its roots. From her window, she could see the vicarage garden, where the Reverend Clement was trimming the last of the dahlias before frost. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the green, and Mrs. Price Ridley's bicycle bell jingled somewhere in the distance. St. Mary Mead was itself again, or at least it wished to be. Inside, Miss Marple sat in her armchair knitting by the fire. Her fingers moved with delicate precision, each stitch as steady as her thoughts. She was not one to brood, nor to glorify her own cleverness, but she did, now and then, allow herself the quiet satisfaction of having restored balance where cruelty had broken it. What troubled her, though what always troubled her, was not the act of murder itself, but the why of it. That ordinary people, in the pursuit of comfort or pride, could step so calmly across the line between right and wrong. She had seen it too often to call it surprise any more, yet each time it wounded her just a little, the way one might feel seeing a rosebush bloom beautifully, only to discover a worm at its heart. She paused, lifting her eyes toward the mantel where a single photograph stood. Her late nephew, Raymond West, looking young and proud beside his wife. He had once told her, "Aunt Jane, you ought to write these things down. Your methods, your stories. The world could learn from you. She had laughed then, a bright bird-like sound. My dear boy, the world isn't nearly as interested in truth as it pretends. It prefers to forget unpleasant things. Now, she smiled faintly at the memory and returned to her knitting. A few moments later, there came a soft knock at the door. It was young Molly Harris, the postmistress's niece, clutching an envelope. "Evening, Miss Marple. Inspector Craythorne asked me to deliver this special." "Thank you, my dear. Do come in and have a biscuit before you run off. It's turning chilly." Molly hesitated only long enough for one bite of shortbread before darting away again, the echo of her laughter fading into the dusk. Miss Marple opened the envelope. Inside was a short note in Craythorne's tidy hand. "Mrs. Pembroke has passed quietly in custody. No trial. She requested her thanks be conveyed to you. Said you were the only one who truly understood her." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Poor soul," she whispered, so afraid of losing what she never truly had. She folded the letter, placed it beside the fire, and watched the flame catch the edge of the paper, curling it inward, blackening the words until they were smoke. Outside the evening deepened. Somewhere a clock struck 7. The kettle began to hum on the hob. Miss Marple rose, filled the teapot, and set out a single cup and saucer. Her ritual, her comfort. As she poured the first stream of amber tea, she murmured to the empty room, "Well, my dear friends, another mystery laid to rest, and tomorrow there will be gardens to tend, and gossip to endure, and life to be lived." The fire crackled softly in reply. Miss Marple sat back, took a slow sip, and let her gaze drift to the window where twilight brushed the glass. Beyond the hedgerows, the village slumbered, peaceful, unsuspecting, beautiful in its smallness. And in that serene stillness, Miss Marple smiled, not with triumph, but with gentle acceptance, for she knew what so few ever did, that beneath every calm surface lies the heartbeat of human folly, forever patient, forever repeating. She took another sip of tea, the faint taste of lemon still lingering on her tongue, and whispered, almost to herself, "The world, I think, will never quite run out of murders, nor of people pretending they couldn't possibly happen here." And with that, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the clock ticking softly beside her, as the firelight danced across her gentle, knowing face. There are few detectives in literature, or indeed in life, who solve crimes not by logic alone, but by the subtle weight of understanding what it means to be human. Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead is one of them. She never sought adventure, nor fame, nor justice in its loudest form. She merely noticed, and in noticing she understood. What others dismissed as gossip, she treated as anthropology. What others called trivial, she saw as the warp and weft of truth itself. For to Miss Marple, the human heart was a pattern she had studied all her life, across teacups, parish meetings, and village fetes. The same pettiness, jealousy, vanity, and fear that appeared in St. Mary Mead were the very same that led to deceit and murder elsewhere. Only the setting changed. The characters never. In this particular case, the so-called murder with lemon scones, Miss Marple had uncovered not merely the crime of one woman, but the deeper, more tragic ailment of the human soul, the desperate need to be thought well of. It was not greed that killed Mrs. Larchmont, nor vengeance that silenced poor Mr. Pritchard. It was pride, that most English of sins, wearing its Sunday best and smiling all the while. And when the end came, with confession, death, and the uneasy return of village calm, Miss Marple, in her quiet wisdom, understood that exposing every truth was not the same as healing it. Some wounds must be covered gently, not pressed open for display. Some guilt must be left to fade in silence, like mist dissolving over the churchyard at dawn. She would never boast of what she had done, nor write it down as Raymond West had once suggested. Her triumphs were not meant for books or police records. They belonged to the private, unglamorous battle between conscience and comfort. A battle she watched unfold endlessly in the lives of others. For that, perhaps, was Miss Marple's truest gift, not the ability to catch killers, but the grace to forgive those who were caught in the snare of their own weakness. And so the story ends as it began. In a quiet English village, where nothing much seems to happen, and yet everything always does. The garden gate creaks, the kettle hums, and Miss Marple, with her lace shawl and her gentle eyes, sits once more by the fire. If you were to pass her cottage at dusk, you might see her silhouette in the window. Small, serene, unassuming. You might think her simply an old woman taking her tea. But look closer, and you'd see the faintest smile upon her lips, a smile of someone who has seen the world as it truly is, and still believes it worth saving. For Miss Marple knows, as perhaps only she can, that beneath every cup of tea, every pleasant conversation, every slice of lemon scone, there lies the fragile and eternal mystery of human nature. And it is, in the end, the greatest mystery of all.